250th birthday, which is tomorrow. June 14th is 250. So, and there's a parade, as we all know. And I can tell you that the soldiers standing in that parade are going to be the unhappiest people about that parade. Nobody likes the parade. Anyway, on Russia and Ukraine, Russia cannot win this war in its current course. Let me state that up front. It cannot win. And the reason it can't win is because it has settled on an attritional strategy. Yeah, Russia's bigger than Ukraine. The Russian military is bigger than Ukraine. But the strategy that Russia has settled on, or has fallen into, because it did not intend to fight this war this way, it's losing about 154 soldiers killed and wounded per square kilometer gained over the last year or so. Now, war is not a math problem, but if Russia's intention is to conquer all of Ukraine and control all of Ukraine, there are about 494,000 square kilometers of Ukraine that it does not control right now. At that pace of losses, it would lose 76 million people trying to conquer all of Ukraine. Again, war doesn't work that way, but that just gives you an idea of the scale of the challenge Russia faces. So it just doesn't have the personnel and can't mobilize the personnel to win the war on its current trajectory. As long as the Ukrainian military continues, if the Ukrainian lines continue to maintain their integrity, Ukraine can afford to give up space incrementally while inflicting, as Janusz said, crippling losses on the Russians and trade space for time. The other reason that Russia can't win this war on its current trajectory is it will take so long that the inherent contradictions in Russia's policy and strategy, political, economic, and military strategy for this war will eventually, I think, show themselves. Putin does not want to repeat the partial mobilization that he did in August and September of 2022, because that, and especially in many of the places that people here in this room represent, since the Russian military involuntarily mobilized people from among the captive nations primarily and tried to spare ethnic Russians and spare urban residents with big urban centers from being mobilized, it was destabilizing for the Russians to do that. Places like Dagestan were very close to erupting into open protests, and so he doesn't want to do that again. So what is he doing? He's still mostly mobilizing from among the captive nation, from among the non-Russian people, but the way they're mobilizing is literally throwing money at people. So a Russian private with the enlistment bonus, with the deployment to Ukraine bonus, not even speaking of if he or she is killed or wounded in action, but a Russian private can earn up to $60,000 a year, which is 4 times the average wage in Russia. And so what that's done is they've expanded the military. They're throwing money at recruits to try to get people to sign up. At the same time, they've expanded the defense industrial base, which is now on a wartime footing. So the military and the defense industry are now competing for labor. So you have wage inflation, you have a labor shortage, you have prohibitively high borrowing rates, 20% interest rates, and collapsing consumer demand. So look, the people who were predicting impending Russian economic collapse on day 2 of the war turned out to be wrong. It's almost 3.5 years in. The Russian economy has done fairly well weathering the impact of the war, but it can't do that forever. And I honestly believe within a year or so, there's a reckoning coming. But Putin also can't afford to end the war, because then you've got literally millions of demobilized soldiers that Russia will struggle to reintegrate into society. So on the current path, it's unsustainable. And the only way Russia can salvage a victory is if the US helps it, frankly. And I hope we don't. Part of the title was post-war scenarios in US policy. So my concern about the way the Trump administration is approaching European security is significant. I guess I'll put it that way. I have significant concern about the way the administration is approaching security in Europe. I think the most charitable interpretation is we're just naive about Russia. There are much less charitable interpretations of why the White House would be doing some of the things it's doing. It looks very likely that 2 of the 5 U.S. Army brigades in Europe will come back and possibly be sent to the southern border. I won't even get into that. probably the brigades in Poland and Romania. This is what it's looking like when the national security strategy comes out. It will direct. Look, decoupling the U.S. from Europe has been a Russian goal since at least 1945. This achieves it. We're making the same mistake we made in the 1990s, only it's less excusable this time. Because in the 1990s, we didn't really believe Russia was a threat. Yeah. We honestly believed that Russia was going to democratize and liberalize and possibly potentially be integrated into European security structures. And so it made sense to draw down from about 300,000 U.S. troops in Europe to 30,000. Ben Hodges, who used to be the commander of U.S. Army Europe, would go around and say, because he was an early advocate of expanding the U.S. military footprint in Europe, he would say, my job is to make 30,000 soldiers look like 300,000 soldiers. Because this was after the first Russian invasion of Ukraine. It took us a long time, and now we appear to be about to repeat the mistake we made in the 90s without the excuse of, because this time we know Russia's a threat. We know Russia's a threat. It has proven itself to be a threat, and so withdrawing, retreating in the face of that threat, I think is a grave error. It's been a core tenet of U.S. national security thinking since the end of the Second World War that given Eurasia's size, population, and resources, concentration of natural resources, the emergence of hegemonic power in Eurasia would be a grave threat to U.S. security. And it's also been a core tenet of U.S. national security policy that the way to prevent that is for the U.S. to be engaged in Europe, engaged in Eurasia. My concern is that if we retrench, Russia clearly has hegemonic designs. It has intentions to become a hegemonic power in Europe and Eurasia. It doesn't have the capability now, but if it wins in Ukraine, it will be one step closer. If it wins in Ukraine, as I said yesterday, Moldova is absolutely next. And then some other, because Moldova is not covered by NATO's Article 5, and so, Russia, Putin doesn't want to trigger Article 5 yet. But Moldova has become sort of the target of a lot of sort of Kremlin propaganda. You can see the fire hose of falsehood now is trained squarely on Moldova. If Russia wins in Ukraine, it will believe, look, it's fighting in Ukraine, it's fighting against us. And I think we have to understand that. It did the same thing in Georgia in 2008. I happened to be in Georgia for 2 years, and left right before the war. The Russian, they issued cards to all the soldiers that took part in the invasion of Georgia, one of these know your enemy cards. And it talked about the Georgian military essentially being an appendage of NATO and an appendage of the United States. US trained, NATO trained, you're fighting NATO. You're fighting NATO, you're fighting in Georgia, but you're fighting NATO. Every time Putin has believed that he's defeated the West, in Georgia in 2008, Ukraine in 2014, the Syria intervention in 2015, he has launched a larger, more ambitious war in the wake of the war in which he believed he defeated us. So we need to get used to the idea that we may not be fighting Russia, but Russia's fighting us. And I think it's time to fight back. And then the final thing I would say is, I think maybe the biggest concern I have about our current track vis-a-vis Europe and European security is I think you're going to see a wave of nuclearization in the wake of the war in Ukraine. The combined impacts of the lessons of Ukraine in terms of the utility of nuclear weapons and U.S. retrenchment and possible the withdrawal of the U.S. extended nuclear deterrent guarantee, I think there are going to be really strong incentives for a lot of our European partners to break out of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and go nuclear, or just not even to break out, the Israeli method, and just to do it. So it's, again, I think we're so focused right now on the costs of leadership, the United States is, that we're not thinking about the benefits that accrue to the U.S. and also, I would argue, accrue to global security and stability by U.S. leadership. So, on that depressing note.